Some people might hear this story and think I deserve what happened to me. I would be the first person not to argue with them though, so please don't think I'm telling this story in order to garner any sort of sympathy or something. The area I grew up in was pretty rural. The school buses didn't even come to pick me up for school. My parents had to drive me. That continued until I was a teenager, and I got my own license and could drive myself. I enjoyed growing up in a place like that though, with so much area to explore, and I explored it a lot of the time. Sometimes it would be with my cousins when they came over to visit us, but more often I would just be going out into the forest and hills all by myself. There was one thing I was taught from a very young age though, whenever I was out exploring. It was made very clear to me that I was not supposed to bother anyone who might be found out in the hills. If I came across any hunters, any hermits, any buildings or barns or anything, I was not to interact with them in any way. My parents told me there could be some very strange people out in the hills, and it was best not to engage with them. I always followed this rule very closely. I actually had some family members who lived in extremely rural areas. This included an uncle of mine who built himself a really small shack out of plywood and lived in it year-round, hunting his own food and stuff like that. I only ever saw him once in a really great while growing up, but he certainly wasn't the kind of guy you would want to come across in the middle of nowhere. A few times when I had gone out hiking, I saw an old cabin down in a holler, far off from my house. I was always curious to go up to the cabin and check it out, but I knew that was a very bad idea. It was against everything I'd been taught about going out in these woods, so I never really attempted to go down and get a closer look. I would always go in a different direction, or if I was with my cousins, I wouldn't even go that way at all. When I was 14 years old, though, my curiosity finally began getting the better of me. Now, although I didn't set out with a plan to go and check out the cabin on this day, I was out and hiking that direction. I hadn't even been thinking of the cabin, but the moment I saw it, my curiosity just absolutely piqued. It didn't take much before I decided I wanted to go down and take a look at this thing. Looking at the cabin, even from a distance, was what changed my mind. I had never seen anything that would indicate to me that it was not an abandoned building. I had come across other abandoned buildings before. Most of them were broken down and not interesting. But this cabin was interesting to me, not only because it was a cabin in the woods, and who's not curious about that, but also because it was mainly intact. I decided to just get a little bit closer. I started slowly going down the hill, wondering if this was a bad idea or not. Of course, the nervousness of doing something I knew I was not supposed to be doing was a bit overwhelming for me. As I got closer and closer, I didn't see anything that would indicate the place was not abandoned. I was hoping I would even be able to find a way in and explore it. I didn't expect to find the Book of the Dead or anything like that. But the building was obviously really old. Maybe there could be some interesting antiques in there. I got a better look than I ever had before. There was a porch on the opposite side that I had never seen before. It was pretty run down. There was moss covering large parts of the cabin, and most of the wood had turned a strange gray color. It also smelled very strangely and very unpleasant, although I was unable to place the exact smell. This convinced me beyond a shadow of a doubt that this place had to be abandoned. Still, I was a bit nervous as I climbed the stairs on the porch. Everything was dead quiet, and like the old cliché, I thought it was way too quiet. I couldn't even hear any animal noises, which was very rare for the area we lived in. Maybe I was blocking them out because I was so fascinated by this cabin, though. I went up to the door, listening to the wood creaking under my feet. Getting up to it, I was getting even more nervous. On some level, I hoped the door would be locked or jammed shut, anything that would make it difficult for me to get in. Then I could just give up and go home. When I reached out and tried to open it, though, I found it was not locked in any way. In fact, I was able to push it open very easily. Looking into the cabin, I was even more convinced no one could be living there. It was extremely nasty inside. Everything was covered in mildew and moss. It looked like no one had been inside the place for 30 years. It made me feel a lot better about the trespassing. I left the door open behind me as I went in to explore the building. There was some primitive and really old furniture in the front room. Nothing I was interested in actually touching, though. There were some old books lying on a table, but they had been so destroyed by the elements that they would crumble if I even poked them. It was an old building, and I was surprised it had more than one room in it. There was a door which I figured led to either a bedroom or a closet. I decided that I had come this far already. I might as well open that door and see what was behind it. I went over to the door and slowly began to open it. When I had totally pulled it open, I noticed it was a completely different room. It was like an old bedroom, having some furnishings inside it. They were just as old and decaying as the rest of the cabin was. That was when I noticed some movement on the bed, though. I hadn't thought it was possible, and I hadn't noticed it at first, but there was someone laying down there. They blended in perfectly with the moss, decay, and grime. They almost seemed like part of the furnishing at first. As this person got up, I realized it was an older guy. My presence in the cabin must have woken him up. He seemed bewildered at first, but that didn't last long. The man started yelling at me in some sort of gibberish language. I couldn't make out his words, but I could definitely tell he was not happy with me being there. The man grabbed a rifle off the floor of the room. I knew I had to get out of this cabin as quickly as possible. "Gonna shoot you!" I heard the man shout at me as he was trying to get up off the bed. He mumbled some more stuff about it being his house, and I could tell how angry the guy was. Terrified, I turned and ran back into the front room of the cabin. Then I ran out the front door, leaving it open behind me. I decided to run a little ways down the holler, then try to get up the hill from there. As I was going, I heard a gunshot go off. I was so terrified by this, I simply dropped to the ground. I wasn't hit or anything, but that wasn't enough to keep me from being scared. I looked back and saw the guy standing out by the cabin. He didn't appear to be chasing me. I had to crawl my ways away, not giving the man another shot at me. I didn't hear any more shots. That made me believe the guy was only trying to scare me maybe, but I couldn't know for sure. He was pretty decrepit, so he could have just been a really bad shot. I had to get to my feet but try to keep down and get up the hill somehow. I felt a lot safer once I'd gotten away. I don't know the situation about the cabin, and I never went near that place again. I always made sure to steer clear of other buildings I found in the woods after. I was 12 when I flew on a plane for the first time, or at least the first time I remember flying on a plane. We were going to visit SeaWorld in Orlando, Florida, and I was really excited. It would be our first family vacation in quite a long time, and I looked forward to the days off from school to spend some time with my family. I was a bit nervous about flying because I didn't remember how it had gone the first technical time, but my parents assured me the process was simple and that I'd be perfectly fine. All we needed was to pass through security and then it would be smooth sailing. At least I thought so. We'd done the whole thing of taking off our shoes, putting any extra items from our bags into the bins, and putting our luggage through the X-ray machine. Everything was going fine, so my parents said the last thing we needed to do was go through the metal detector, and then we'd be free to go. When it was my turn, however, the machine beeped, and an older man dressed in a TSA uniform stopped me. He said he would need to give me a pat down. I motioned to my parents to wait for me while he took me to the side. My mom looked like she was about to say something, but thought better of it. Maybe one of my zippers had messed with the machine, or perhaps it was just a misfire. Of course, these things I'd only thought of in hindsight years later. In the moment, I was really nervous. I'd never gone through something like this before, but my parents assured me from across the machine that everything would be fine and to do what the agent said. The next few minutes were terrifying. At first, the agent was entirely professional, just lightly tapping my sides and going over my pockets, but when he reached my hips, I immediately felt his hand grip me hard. Even though I'd never gone through something like this before, something in my gut knew this was intentional. The agent was breathing heavily. I can still feel his breath on my face even years later. He leaned in real close to my ear and said something that shook me to my core. "How old are you? You're really sexy." I'd never felt so gross in my entire life. Even after I went through my teen years and all that came with it, I remember squeaking out a random number. The guy frowned and let me go with a big sigh. I ran over to my parents, feeling like I might cry, but not wanting to let the guy get the satisfaction of seeing so. My mom immediately honed in on that fact. She knew well my about to cry face. She took me to the bathroom for some privacy and asked me what was wrong. Thankfully, the bathroom didn't have too many people. Once they left, I was able to let it all out. My mom hugged me as the tears stained her shirt and told me, "We'll fix this. It'll be all right." Once I'd cried my lungs out and she helped me clean up, we exited the restroom to meet my, at this point, very concerned dad. My mom brought him up to speed, and as soon as she mentioned what the agent said, he stormed back to the security line and demanded to speak to someone in charge. I didn't want to be anywhere near that guy again, so me and my mom stayed back and kind of out of sight. The guy was still at his spot near the metal detector, and when he saw my dad storming towards him with a furious look on his face, his eyes went big as saucers and he called someone on his radio. My dad lost it on the guy, swearing and making sure everyone around them knew what he'd done. Now, my dad's not a violent man, but I swear if that guy said one more word before a supervisor came, he would have knocked him out. The supervisor looked initially confused, but as my dad explained what happened, they immediately took action. 2 men grabbed the agent's arms and all but dragged him away, I think to an office. Security came to question us a moment later. Both my parents held my hand as I described what happened. The officers that interviewed us were very kind actually. They said they would deal with him properly and hoped we'd enjoy our flight. We tried our best, but needless to say, the excitement was shattered the moment that man touched me. The trip was fun, but I remember it being kind of muted. Like the shadow of that airport incident loomed over the journey. Everything went a lot better on the return flight home. I remember feeling so much anxiety though, whenever a TSA agent so much as looked at me. My parents must have felt the same way, because they stuck close to me all throughout. Luckily, the man from before was nowhere to be seen. The next time I go on a plane, I hope it stays that way. That goes for all creepy people at airports. In high school, I was left alone a lot on the weekends. My parents were separated at the time, and I lived with my mom, while my dad lived in an apartment in the next town over. My mom often went out with friends to party and drink, and often crashed at their houses to prepare for the next night. That meant I was left alone for 2 days until Monday, which honestly I was fine with. My mom and I didn't have the best relationship to say the least, but since she was the more financially stable parent, I was forced to live with her when I would have taken my dad any day. That's another story though. What I'm here to talk about is a night where I was home alone. Not unusual in itself, but what happened during that span of time definitely was. My mom was gone, of course, out partying or nursing a hangover probably. I set out to tidy up around the house a bit and make myself some dinner. After finding out there wasn't really much to eat though, as my mom rarely went shopping unless she absolutely needed to, I set myself up for ordering a pizza. Luckily, the local shop delivered, so I thought I was all set to fend off my hunger for a couple of days. I ordered a large pizza with a side of pasta and watched a few episodes of Say Yes to the Dress while waiting. Cut to an hour later though, and my pizza still had not arrived. I called up the shop and they said they were running a bit behind, but my order should be there relatively soon. I said thanks and resigned myself to waiting it out, my stomach growling all the while. I was really gonna tear into that pizza as soon as I opened the box. Then a knock came at the front door. We usually used the back door to go in and out, but kept the front open for deliveries. I looked out through the peephole and saw a girl about my age. She had a hat on with the shop's logo and was rifling through a carrying bag for my order. Breathing a sigh of relief, I opened the door. The girl immediately shot up to look at me, as if she hadn't actually expected me to answer. "Oh, here's your order," she said, thrusting the pizza and pizza boxes into my hands. I don't have any cash on me, so I can't do any change tonight. Bad night for tips, huh?" I asked, setting the boxes down on the floor. I guess you could say that." The girl laughed nervously. My stomach rumbled as I gave her the cash. I was just about to say goodbye and close the door when the girl suddenly said in a frantic voice, "Wait!" I opened the door back up. That's when I noticed the bruises dotting the girl's arm for the first time. She was wearing a t-shirt, and I could see these marks that looked like someone had grabbed her hard around the upper arm. All I could really say was, "Are you okay?" The girl looked dejected and really small at that moment. "No, I try to keep it to myself, but the reason I don't have any cash on me is I just got robbed." She broke down, telling me that she'd been making pretty good tips that night from working all afternoon and was about to go home when her boss told her she had to work overtime. It was either that or, in his words, "don't bother coming back to work." She really needed the money, so when my order came in, she went. She couldn't find my house easily because the GPS was being wonky, so when someone flagged her car down and asked if she was lost, she gratefully stopped and rolled down her window. Big mistake. Her second mistake was forgetting to lock her passenger door. The guy ripped it open and jumped in beside her. He shoved a knife in her face and grabbed her arm and demanded she give him any money she had. He said he wouldn't hurt her if she did, and to do it quickly. Fortunately, the guy actually kept his word, and once he bagged all the cash he had, a total of $100, he got out and vanished, leaving her alone and unable to process what just happened. I didn't know what to say. The girl said she didn't know what to do other than to come to my house and see if she could use my phone. The whole event didn't even seem real. She didn't know how she was going to explain the whole thing to her boss either. She was scared she was going to get fired for it. I let her inside and gave her the phone to call her boss and the police, who came to pick her up and the car. I don't know what happened to the girl after she left. I don't even know her name. I hope she got out from under her shitty boss and found a better job, one where she won't be in danger of being robbed again. I didn't tell my mom about the whole ordeal either. I continued to stay home alone on the weekends for a bit, but I didn't order pizza from that shop for a long while after. I felt bad the robbery had happened so close to my home, and I didn't want another delivery person to go through that just because I was home alone and a bit hungry. This isn't a very long story, but it was pretty scary to me when it happened. Hell, it still gives me chills when I think about it. I lived in a lot of places when I was growing up, both urban and rural. For the majority of my life, though, I lived in the city, including most of the years in which I was growing up. There were a few years in my early teens that we lived out in the country, though. It was quite a bit of a change for me, and it was very hard to get used to. We lived in a pretty nice house up on a hill by itself. It was surrounded by a lot of other hills, trees, and things of that nature. It's important to know that there were no people close by, and we didn't really know anyone in the area. I was 13 years old, and I had been left home alone one evening. I got a call from my parents telling me they weren't sure when they would be getting back. It was storming really badly, and they didn't want to risk getting into an accident on the way home. I was okay with being home alone for a while. I really enjoyed storms, so I was just going to have a night home by myself watching some television. The storm was really going strong. I was sitting in the living room watching TV and having a nice time for a couple of hours after my parents had called. There was a loud booming crack of thunder that caused me to look out the front window though, and when I did, I almost jumped out of my seat in surprise. I could see there was a strange man standing at my window, looking in at me. After another lightning bolt flashed soon after, he was already gone. I could still hear him out there, pounding on my front door. It was a really loud and fast pounding. Well, I wasn't about to answer that door for him. I was really scared. I ran into the kitchen and grabbed a knife from the cutting block. I went and sat back down on the couch, facing the door with my knife pointed at it. The pounding probably didn't last very long, but it seemed like forever to me. I was really happy I'd grown up in the city and kept the door locked even when I was home. I wasn't worried about the guy going to another door. Suddenly, the knocking stopped altogether. It didn't come back either. The storm kept raging throughout the night, and I continued to sit there with the knife in my hand, not sure if the guy had actually left or not. I kept waiting for him to come back, but he never did, fortunately. That was the only really scary thing to happen to me back when I lived out there. It wasn't long after that we went back to the city. I don't really live out in the country per se, but I do live in a rural town. Well, I don't really live in town, but rather on the side of a hill just outside of town. There's a gym in town, and the hill is right behind it. There are a few houses up on that hill too, though not too close together. My house is on the very top. I also live by myself. I rented the house from the owner for about 10 years now, and I've even stayed living there after this incident happened. And the reason I mention the gym is because I had a membership there. The gym was also open 24 hours, which I admit was a little bit weird for a small town. The best part about that, though, was that I could work out at any time of night and no one else would be at the gym. I much preferred working out alone, plus I've always been a night person. It was perfect for me. For the most part, I never really had any problem with it. Not only did this happen in the middle of the night, it also happened around the Christmas holiday. It was very cold outside. The people who live in this area are mostly used to warmer weather throughout the year, so they tended to keep indoors even more during this time than they did during the rest of the year. Normally, I would have headed to the gym around 11:30 or so I would get there just a little after midnight. I'd never learned to drive and still haven't to this day, so I always walked to the gym. On this night, though, I ended up leaving a little bit late. I'm not sure why. Probably something on the internet that caught my interest and kept me from leaving on time. Not an unusual thing to happen. There weren't any lights along the road up the hill. At the most, one of the few houses there might have their porch light on. Otherwise, the walk was a very dark one. I had made it so many times, though, that it was completely second nature to me. It was different this time, though, because of how hard it was snowing outside. That somehow made it seem even darker, if you understand what I mean. It's so much harder to see where you're going in the snow. Plus, you have to pay attention to where you're walking much more carefully. You don't want to take a slip, especially if you're walking down a big hill. It was very cold, very dark, and very quiet outside. I wasn't really scared, though. I was used to being in the dark by now, and I knew that normally no scary things were out there hiding in it. As I walked by the other houses, I noticed that no one really was awake at this time of night. Not only were all the porch lights off, but the inside lights were all out too. I didn't have a chance of getting some extra light for seeing my way. After a while, I began to hear some crunching in the snow. It took me a few moments, but I realized that someone else was out here walking as well. That was unusual, but I didn't immediately think anything was wrong about it. There were other people living out here on the hill, so it wasn't inconceivable that someone else decided to take a walk at night. However, this was the first time I had ever encountered someone. Naturally, I turned to look around. It was no different than hearing any noise you would normally hear and turning to look at it, but I didn't see anyone there. I kept walking, and the whole time I could hear someone else walking behind me. Every time I turned to see if someone was out there, though, I couldn't find them. It was too dark outside, and the snow was falling too heavily to see much of anything. I didn't really think much about it, though. I just kept on my way. When going downhill, the first building you come to is the gym, so when I got to the parking lot, I sprinted over to the door. I scanned my card to get in, then closed the door behind me. As I was closing the door, I noticed someone walking up to the gym as well. He didn't come all the way up to the door, though. He stood at the very end, just out of my line of sight. It didn't really start getting weird until right around then. The guy out there was obviously not a gym member. He didn't have a card to get in, and he didn't try to get me to let him in either. I wouldn't have if he tried, but other people had tried in the past. As I was working out, he remained outside the building. That would have been weird enough, but he kept walking back and forth. There was lighting outside the gym, so I was able to see him better than when I was walking earlier. It didn't reveal much of anything, though. All he was doing was walking back and forth, from one end of the gym to the other, his hands in his pockets and his hat pulled down to cover his face. I work out usually for about an hour and a half. First, I do 45 minutes of cardio with 10 minutes of cool down, followed by some weightlifting. The reason I mention this is because the man stayed out there the entire time. Despite the cold and snow, he did not leave. The entire time, he kept creeping around the building. Hell, I even tried drawing my workout out just to give this guy time to leave, but it didn't seem to matter. He kept himself right outside the place, walking right where I could see him. After the workout ended, I really didn't know what to do. I took a shower even though I would usually wait until I got home to do that, but this guy was still out there. I was worried. Even if someone else had come into the gym at this time, it wouldn't have helped. I would have still had to walk home, and if this person meant me ill, they would still be out there. I went into one of the tanning rooms, which had heavy wooden doors, and locked it from the inside. I wasn't sure what I was supposed to do. Eventually, I fell asleep in the chair. I woke up to someone pounding on the door. At first, I was terrified. That didn't ease up when I heard them telling me they were the police. I mean, if someone was trying to get through the door, they would have been able to lie. I did go ahead and open it though, and it really was the police. Turns out, while I was hiding in the tanning room, someone had busted open the glass door. They were gone, however, by the time the police showed up. They had already checked the cameras, and it showed them it was not me who did it, so I didn't get into any trouble. They weren't able to tell who the intruder was, though, and wanted to know if I'd seen anything. I explained to them what I had seen earlier, which didn't really help since I never got a great look at the guy. It got further bad because I was too scared to go walking out at night for a while. I had to adjust my schedule and work out during the day. It's even worse, thinking it might have been someone who lived up on that hill. Unfortunately, I never found out who it was, and that made things difficult for quite a while after. When a couple of friends, let's call them Gary and Martha, told me they were going to sell their car on Craigslist for tuition money, I thought it was a bit sketchy at best. I was also in a similar boat though. COVID money had started to run out, and classes were coming up. I tried not to judge. We were all desperate for money to make ends meet, and if selling on a sketchy site famously known for hosting ads by a serial killer floats your boat, you do you. Anyway, I tried really hard not to judge. Lots of people have sold and bought things on Craigslist without any trouble, so I wished them luck, but kept tabs on how the situation was going from time to time. They said they had a few offers, but nothing substantial, either well below their asking price or the buyer was flaky with messages or extremely weird. Nothing too crazy though. That was until they got a message from someone named Chris. Chris said that he was in a real pinch and had been looking for a car before his wife gave birth to their baby. He wasn't having much luck, and said he was even willing to pay more than their original asking price. My friends were thrilled and messaged him back right away to set up a time to meet and look over the car. They thought they'd really hit a stroke of good fortune. I was optimistic for them and hoped Chris liked the car. From what I heard, they were going to meet that Friday afternoon, about a week after their first message. Chris would be getting a ride from a friend, and they planned to take the car for a test drive around the block before making any final decisions. My friends thought this sounded reasonable, so they busied themselves with cleaning the car and making it as nice as possible. They told me about the travel courses they could take with the extra money. They'd been eyeing a 2-week cultural course in Costa Rica for quite some time. As far as I know, they were probably registering for it as they messaged me. However, the day didn't quite go as planned. Martha was called into an extra shift at work, meaning Gary would be home alone to meet Chris and his friend. Gary thought it would be alright, if just a little awkward, as Martha was usually the social butterfly of the two. He told her he'd push through it though, and she went on her way. Gary later said he waited a long time for Chris to show up. They lived in a house-style apartment down the street from campus, basically a house split in half the vertical way, with a pretty open parking space. You couldn't miss it if anyone turned in. Chris was supposed to get there by noon, but he turned out to be an hour late. Gary happened to be looking out his window, just on the verge of calling and canceling, when an unfamiliar green Chevy pulled into the parking space. Gary was just relieved it didn't end up being a waste of time. He went out to greet them. Chris looked exactly like who he said he was, a young man in his mid-20s. He had short cropped brown hair and a skinny frame, essentially an average father-to-be looking man. His friend was a slightly bigger guy that didn't seem to have a lot to say. They went over to the car and Chris seemed to like what he was seeing. Gary said he almost gushed about how his wife would love it, how it was perfect for the baby and all that. It was almost overwhelming. Anyway, they went for the test drive to seal the deal. Chris hopped in the driver's seat while Gary sat shotgun. Chris's friend took the seat behind Gary, and off they went with Gary directing. The plan was to take a couple of turns around some side streets, go through campus, then turn around and take a parallel road back to their apartment. Everything seemed to be going fine at first. Chris was still talking Gary's ear off, and Gary was thinking the sale was all but final. The friend was still quietly idling in the back seat. Campus was pretty busy that day, so they got some good testing of the brakes due to jaywalkers. Chris didn't seem to mind. The problem came when they were supposed to start heading back. Gary directed Chris to the turn, but instead of taking it, he shot right past it and started to head out of town. He said it was because they wanted to do a little more driving, to see how it did on more remote roads. Gary felt a little weirded out, but he thought he might as well go along with it. Wasn't much he could do anyway. They continued to drive. The road became surrounded by thick walls of trees on either side and developed dangerous curves the further they went along. Chris had gone completely quiet at this point. Gary was really starting to sweat. He didn't know what was going on here exactly, but this was not what he'd signed up for. He told Chris he wanted to head back to make the sale final and clean up before Martha came home, but Chris ignored him. He started to reach for the door handle, but Chris pushed the driver's side button to lock it. Gary asked him what the hell he was doing, and that's when all hell broke loose. Chris's friend in the back seat lunged at him with something like a wire in his hand and tried to wrap it around Gary's neck. He saw black spots at the end of his vision as the wire started to dig into his skin and tighten around his throat. He remembered flailing his hands back at the guy, slapping, scratching, punching, anything to get himself free, but it was no use. He couldn't get a breath in. His entire face felt hot, and he could hear pounding in his ears. His eyes started to roll back in his head. He could vaguely hear Chris shouting something like, "Stop, you're gonna kill him, dude!" That's when Gary blacked out. He doesn't know how or why, but against all odds, Chris's accomplice stopped and he somehow survived. He woke up lying on the side of the road somewhere outside of town. He was filthy and covered in mud. It was the late afternoon and raining, so he must have been out for quite a while. He said he sat up eventually and looked around. He was surrounded by trees with no civilization in sight. Chris and the car were both gone. His neck throbbed and ached whenever something brushed up against it. He didn't know how far he was from town, so on stiff and sore legs he got up and started walking. Thankfully, he was going in the right direction and soon saw the towering campus buildings in the distance. He said he almost cried and laughed at the same time when he saw it. Martha was frantic when he got home. He left his phone and wallet on the counter and didn't leave a note, so she didn't know where he possibly could have gone. When he told her what happened with Chris, she just collapsed and sobbed into his chest for a while. Though they did make a police report, they eventually just said screw Chris and screw the car when nothing came up. They and I guessed that carjacking them had been the plan all along. It worked out better for them to get Gary alone and vulnerable. I'm not sure why the friend was so violent about it, but we concluded it was better not to question it. Long story short, my friends don't sell anything on Craigslist or online without a valid ID anymore. I was just fresh off a major split-up when some friends of mine encouraged me to use Tinder. After witnessing my friend use it himself, I decided to give it a go. What could possibly go wrong, I thought. I spent hours on end swiping and swiping. Some matched, some didn't. It was pretty fun. Then I swiped Linda, and to my surprise we matched, a decision I'd end up regretting later. We spoke for a few weeks on and off, and got to know each other. She seemed like a nice enough girl at first. She was a bit older than me, yet looked a whole lot younger. She wasn't fussed about going out for a meal or a cinema trip, or anything traditionally romantic, so we arranged to meet up at a bar instead. At first glance, she was barely recognizable from her profile picture. She looked a lot older and had clearly gained a lot of weight since it was taken. Already the first red flag was starting to show. That's not the major problem though. We got our drinks and got into some good conversations. We actually seemed to have quite a lot in common. Maybe a bit too much, actually. My instincts were telling me that perhaps she had done some research on me somehow and was doing her best to try and impress me. There came a point of awkward silence. I thought I'd say something to kind of break the ice, but instead she beat me to it. "Alright, well, let's talk about sex," she said. I was too stunned to get my head around how forward and straight to the point she was. She asked me about my sex life and what stuff I got up to with my previous partners. We exchanged our stories, but to be honest, mine didn't seem half as exciting as her dramatic ones. I made some stuff up. I never felt comfortable talking about this to someone on a first date anyway. It was at this point she would reveal something to me that made me sick from the pit of my stomach. She told me she liked bondage and that she liked to torture and abuse people just for fun. One story in particular she told me was that she had tricked a man into getting into bed with her and how shocked he was to lie down and discover the bed was full of thumbtacks. At this point, I was very quickly slurping my drink, getting out my excuses to get ready to leave. That's when she told me her final story. She told me that only the week before meeting me, she'd met a man from Tinder and got him to take her to his own flat. She said she was well prepared and had a bag full of items in her car. Bondage tools, she said. To my horror, she told me she had wrapped him up in cling film over and over again, from head to toe until he was almost mummified. She had then left him there on his own in the flat and abandoned him. She laughed as she impersonated his mumbles and pleas for help. "Yeah, he's probably dead by now," she said, chuckling as she sipped on her drink casually. At this point, I thought I needed to get out of there. There was no more point in staying. I didn't even want to question if that was a joke or not. I just got up and left. She attempted to grab and kiss me, but I swerved out of her way. I just got up and left as soon as I could. Safe to say I never met her again, and I hope I never will either. I did report her soon after, but the police didn't seem to take it very seriously, and I never heard anything back for a follow-up.